Wealthy CEO's marriage ends after his accident. He finds love again in his physical therapist. Drop, drop, drop. David Reynolds watched the 4 fluid drips slowly into his vein, each drop marking another second of his shattered life. 3 days. That's how long he'd been unconscious after the crash. 3 days of darkness while his world crumbled around him. His left leg was a mess of metal pins and bandages. The doctor said he'd walk again, maybe. The nerve damage was still unknown. 6 months of recovery, they said. Maybe more. But it wasn't the physical pain that was destroying him. It was the silence. No phone ringing with business calls. No Amanda chattering about her day, her charity events, her social calendar. Just the steady beep of machines monitoring his broken body and the slow drip of medication keeping him conscious enough to face what his life had become. Each drop reminded him that the man who'd built an empire was now just another patient in a hospital bed, watching his marriage dissolve along with everything else he thought mattered. The doctors had explained everything with clinical precision when David first woke up, their voices floating through the fog of pain medication like distant radio broadcasts. Shattered left leg. Torn ACL. Damaged cartilage. Possible nerve damage that could affect him for the rest of his life. Mr. Reynolds, can you hear me clearly? Dr. Martinez had asked, leaning over the hospital bed with the practiced concern of someone who delivered life-changing news every day. David had tried to nod, but even that simple movement sent shockwaves through his body. How bad is it? 6 months of recovery minimum. Maybe more. Dr. Martinez's voice was matter-of-fact as he examined David's chart, but not unkind. The surgery went well, but there was significant trauma to the surrounding tissue. Physical therapy will be extensive, and I need to be honest with you, your leg will never be quite the same. What does that mean exactly? David had asked, though part of him didn't want to know. You'll walk again. You'll be able to function normally for most activities. But running marathons, climbing construction sites in work boots, the kind of physical demands your lifestyle required, those days are over. David had nodded slowly, still groggy from the pain medication, not fully understanding what those words would mean for everything he'd built. Reynolds Construction. The largest commercial building company on the West Coast. His corner office on the 42nd floor overlooking a city skyline dotted with buildings bearing his signature. Glass towers that had reflected his success back at him every morning for 20 years. Welcome back to Mr. Ashbourne Golden Narratives, where every story transforms how you see love and loss. I'm your storyteller, and today's journey will move you to tears. The penthouse apartment. The architectural magazine features. The charity galas where he and Amanda were photographed as the perfect power couple. The board meetings where his word carried the weight of millions in development deals. At 42, David had measured his life in concrete and steel, in square footage and profit margins, in the envious glances of other men when Amanda walked into a room wearing a dress that cost more than most people's monthly salary. He drove a Maserati because it announced his success before he even stepped out of it. He lived in a penthouse because the address meant something to the people whose opinions he'd thought mattered. Amanda, beautiful, ambitious, perfectly groomed Amanda, had been the final piece of his success puzzle. A woman whose smile could light up any charity gala and whose connections opened doors that even his money couldn't unlock. She knew exactly which wine to order at which restaurant, which charity events would photograph well for the society pages, which investments would make them look cultured and socially conscious. Life had been a blueprint he'd executed flawlessly, each achievement carefully planned and systematically obtained. Until that night on Interstate 405 when everything collapsed in the span of 3 seconds that would replay in his mind for months to come. The rain had been coming down hard that Tuesday night, turning Los Angeles freeways into rivers of brake lights and frustration. David was rushing home from a client dinner at Mastro's, a 3-hour affair with potential investors from Tokyo who were considering a $50 million development project in downtown LA. His phone had been buzzing constantly on the passenger seat. Text after text from Amanda about some charity auction she wanted to attend that weekend, something about raising money for children's literacy. Important social appearances, she'd called them. Opportunities to be seen with the right people, to network with wives of city council members who could smooth the way for future permits and approvals. Call me when you get this, her latest message read. The Hendersons will be there, and you know how important Richard's endorsement could be for the Miracle Mile project. David had been thinking about that endorsement, about the politics of success, about the delicate dance of relationships that kept his business empire running smoothly. He'd reached for the phone to call her back, to discuss strategy for working the room at Saturday's event, to plan their approach to securing Richard Henderson's support. 1 second of inattention. 1 moment of taking his eyes off the rain-slicked road. That's when he saw it, the 18-wheeler jackknifing across 3 lanes like a massive steel death trap, sliding through the rain with unstoppable momentum, heading straight for his lane. The driver had lost control, the truck's trailer swinging wide, blocking the entire freeway in a scene that looked like something from an action movie except for the terrible reality that David was about to become part of it. "Oh God," the words barely escaped his lips before impact. The collision was thunder and lightning combined, metal crushing metal with a violence that seemed impossible. Glass exploding like deadly confetti, showering the interior of his car with fragments that caught the freeway lights like scattered diamonds. His Maserati spinning across lanes of traffic before slamming into the median barrier with a final, decisive crash that seemed to echo forever in the sudden silence that followed. The last thing David remembered was the strange peace that settled over everything after the chaos, the way the rain sounded different hitting the crumpled roof of his car, the distant sirens that seemed to be coming from another world entirely. Now, lying in this hospital bed with an 4-drip marking time, David realized that his perfect life had been built on foundations far more fragile than any building he'd ever constructed. Amanda visited during those first days after he woke up, and David found himself studying her with the clarity that sometimes comes with trauma. She brought flowers, expensive arrangements from Blossoms on Rodeo, the florist they always used for their dinner parties, and wore the worried wife expression she'd perfected for public appearances. But David could see the calculation behind her green eyes, the way she glanced at her Cartier watch when she thought he wasn't looking, how she positioned herself carefully when his business associates came by to check on him. "The important thing is that you're alive, darling," she said one afternoon, her voice carrying the precise tone she used when discussing charity donations at board meetings. She squeezed his hand with manicured fingers that felt cold despite her warm words, her 3-carat engagement ring pressing against his skin. "The doctors say you'll make a full recovery." "Dr. Martinez said my leg will never be the same," David replied, watching her face carefully. "Well, you'll adapt. You're strong. And we have excellent insurance." Amanda smoothed her designer dress, something new he'd never seen before, probably purchased during one of her therapeutic shopping trips while he was unconscious. "Marcus stopped by the office yesterday. He says the Henderson project is moving forward smoothly. Everyone sends their love." But they both knew that wasn't entirely true. "I have that luncheon with the mayor's wife today," she'd say, checking her reflection in the hospital room's small mirror. "You know how important it is to maintain our relationships with city leadership, especially now." "Especially now?" David had asked. "Well, with your condition we need to make sure people remember that Reynolds Construction is still a force in this city. That we're still players." David found himself staring at the ceiling of his hospital room during the long hours between her visits, counting the holes in the acoustic tiles, 847 holes in the section directly above his bed, wondering when his wife had become a stranger who spoke in press releases and thought in terms of public relations damage control. Or maybe she'd always been a stranger, and he'd just been too busy building his empire to notice that their marriage had become another business arrangement, another strategic alliance designed to benefit both their brands. The real blow came 6 weeks after the accident, on a Thursday afternoon when the physical therapist had just finished putting David through his first attempts at walking with a walker. His leg felt like it was on fire, every step a reminder of how far he'd fallen from the man who used to climb scaffolding and walk construction sites for hours without thinking twice. He was sitting on the edge of his hospital bed, catching his breath and trying not to show how much the simple act of walking 20 feet had exhausted him, when Amanda arrived. "David, we need to talk." She sat in the visitor's chair, maintaining careful distance from his hospital bed, crossing her legs with the elegance she'd perfected over 8 years of being Mrs. David Reynolds. He lowered himself onto the thin mattress, his leg throbbing with a pain that shot through his entire body like electricity. "What about our future?" Amanda took a breath, the kind actors take before delivering lines they've memorized. "This isn't the life I signed up for, David. When we got married, I thought we understood each other. I thought we had the same goals, the same vision for what our life would be. We did. We do." David heard the desperation creeping into his voice and hated himself for it. "Amanda, this is temporary. I'll recover. The business will recover. We just need time. Time won't change the fundamental problem." She stood up, pacing to the window that overlooked the hospital parking lot, a view that was about as far from their penthouse vistas as possible. "I married a powerful man, someone who could give me the lifestyle I wanted, the opportunities one deserved. Someone who commanded respect, who built empires, who made things happen in this city." She gestured at his leg brace, at the walker leaning against the wall, at the modest rehabilitation center he'd been transferred to when their insurance company balked at covering the expensive private facility indefinitely. But now, look at this place, David. Look at where we are. This isn't Cedars-Sinai. This isn't the kind of place where people like us are supposed to end up. I'm still the same person, Amanda. David's voice cracked slightly, betraying the fear he was trying to hide. My leg is injured, not my brain. Not my ability to run the company, to build things, to provide for us. No, you're not the same person. And neither am I. She turned back to face him, smoothing her designer dress with practiced movements. I've had 6 weeks to think about this, to really examine what I want from my life. And I can't do this anymore. I can't pretend to be someone I'm not. The irony of her words hit David like another collision. She couldn't pretend to be someone she wasn't? What about the 8 years of their marriage where she'd pretended to love him for who he was, rather than what he could provide? What about all the evenings when she'd pretended to care about his day, his dreams, his thoughts about anything beyond their social calendar and financial portfolio? Amanda, please. We can work through this. Couples face challenges all the time. This is what marriage means, being there for each other when things get difficult. That's a beautiful sentiment, David, but it's not realistic. Not for people like us. Amanda picked up her purse. I need security. I need stability. I need a future that I can count on. You can't promise me any of that anymore. What are you talking about? The doctor said. The doctor said maybe 6 months. Maybe more. Maybe your leg will be functional. Maybe the nerve damage won't be permanent. Maybe you'll be able to walk normally again. Amanda's voice was getting sharper, more impatient. Maybe isn't good enough for me, David. I can't build a life on maybe. She moved toward the door, then paused, not quite looking back at him. David could see her reflection in the window, beautiful, composed, already gone even though she was still standing in the room. I've already spoken to my lawyer. Jonathan Steinberg, you know him, he handled the Morrison divorce last year. He says it should be straightforward since we kept our finances mostly separate. You'll keep the business, what's left of it anyway. I'll take the penthouse and my settlement. Settlement? The word felt foreign in David's mouth. The prenup covers most of it, but there are shared assets, joint investments. Things we acquired together. Amanda's tone was purely business now, like she was discussing a corporate merger rather than the dissolution of 8 years of marriage. Jonathan says I'm entitled to half the appreciation on the penthouse, plus the art collection and a portion of the liquid assets. David felt something cold settle in his stomach. You've already talked to a lawyer? How long have you been planning this? For the first time during the entire conversation, Amanda's composure cracked slightly. A flush of color rose in her cheeks and she looked away, unable to meet his eyes. Where will you go? The question slipped out before David could stop it, though part of him already knew the answer. Marcus has offered me a place to stay while I figure things out. Just temporarily, you understand. Until I can find something suitable. Marcus Webb. His former business partner. The man David had trusted with half his company's major projects, who had access to client lists and financial information, who knew every detail of their business operations. The man who'd sent flowers and well wishes after the accident, who'd called personally to promise that he'd keep things running until David could return. The man who'd apparently been planning to steal David's wife along with his business. How long? David asked quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. How long what? How long have you and Marcus been planning this? How long have you been discussing my future behind my back while I've been lying here thinking my wife was grieving for our old life along with me? Amanda's silence was answer enough. She straightened her shoulders, lifted her chin with the pride she'd always worn like armor, and walked toward the door with the same confidence she'd used to walk into his life 8 years ago. The papers will be served in a few days. Try not to take this personally, David. It's just business. Just business. 8 years of marriage and she was calling it just business. She left without another word, her heels clicking down the hospital corridor, leaving behind only the faint scent of her expensive perfume and the sound of his heart breaking in ways that had nothing to do with physical trauma. The divorce papers were served 2 days later, delivered by a courier. David had signed them from his hospital bed, his hand shaking slightly as he wrote his name on documents that reduced his marriage to a list of assets and liabilities, terms and conditions, as if love could be divided like stock options and real estate holdings. By the time David was discharged 6 weeks later, the transformation was complete and very public. Amanda had moved out of their penthouse and into Marcus's downtown loft. The betrayal wasn't just personal, it was strategic, calculated, and designed to send a message to everyone in their social and business circles about who was still standing after the dust settled. The penthouse was sold to cover debts and legal fees, the closing handled by Amanda's lawyer while David was still using a walker to navigate his temporary rehabilitation facility. He'd gone from measuring his life in concrete and steel to measuring it in steps taken without his walker, in bills he could still afford to pay with what remained of his savings, in the endless silence of an apartment where no one called and no one visited. The phone that had once buzzed constantly with business opportunities and social invitations now sat silent for days at a time. But David had no idea that this complete destruction of everything he thought he wanted was about to lead him to everything he never knew he needed. Sometimes the strongest foundations are built on the rubble of everything that came before. 3 months of isolation had taught David that silence could be louder than any construction site he'd ever managed. The Santa Monica apartment felt like a waiting room for a life that might never resume, each day blending into the next with the numbing routine of someone who had lost not just his mobility but his purpose. His morning routine had become a meditation on loss. Wake up. Test the leg. Count how many steps he could take before the pain became unbearable. Eat breakfast alone while watching construction crews work on a hotel across the street. Other people building things while he sat on the sidelines of his own profession. Check emails that were mostly bills and automated updates from accounts he no longer had the money to maintain. He found himself on a Tuesday morning, sitting in the waiting room of Westside Physical Therapy, a modest clinic wedged between grind coffee and marina cleaners on a busy street that smelled like espresso and detergent. The waiting room was nothing like the sterile, expensive rehabilitation center his insurance had initially covered. Faded motivational posters hung on beige walls, inspirational quotes about perseverance and strength that felt hollow when you were living them rather than reading them. David Reynolds? He looked up to see a woman in her early 30s with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail that somehow managed to be both professional and effortlessly beautiful. I'm Billionaire Santos, your physical therapist. Ready to get started? David struggled to his feet, pride making him wave off her offered assistance even though his leg protested every movement with sharp reminders of how far he'd fallen. I should warn you, I'm not the most patient patient. I'm used to results happening on my timeline. Billionaire's smile was genuine, not the polite expression he'd grown accustomed to from medical staff who knew his insurance status and treated him accordingly. This smile reached her eyes and seemed to find something amusing in his confession. Good thing I'm not looking for patient. I'm looking for persistent. And maybe a little bit stubborn. That usually helps with the harder exercises. So tell me about your goals, Mr. Reynolds. What does success look like to you in terms of your recovery? David considered the question as he settled onto the examination table. I want to get back to normal. I want to be able to walk construction sites, climb stairs without thinking about it, run if I need to. I want my life back. That's a good start. But let me ask you something else. What if normal isn't the goal? What if the goal is better? Better? David let his skepticism show. I used to run 5 miles every morning. I climbed construction sites in work boots. I never thought twice about my body's ability to do what I needed it to do. How is anything going to be better than that? Billionaire began her assessment, testing his range of motion with gentle but firm pressure that revealed just how much ground he had to make up. Better doesn't always mean the same physical capabilities. Sometimes it means stronger in different ways. More aware of what your body is telling you. More appreciative of movement when it comes easily. That sounds like a consolation prize thinking. Does it? Or does it sound like someone who's learned that strength comes in different forms? The first session was brutal. Not just physically, though David's legs screamed in protest at every movement, but emotionally. Billionaire pushed him through exercises that exposed every weakness, every limitation he'd been trying to ignore during his months of isolation. Simple leg extensions that left him sweating. Balance exercises that made him feel like a toddler learning to walk. Stretches that revealed how much flexibility he'd lost while lying in hospital beds and sitting in his apartment. Lift your leg higher, Mr. Reynolds. I know it hurts, but the muscle memory won't return if you don't challenge it. David gritted his teeth, sweat beading on his forehead from what should have been a simple movement. This is ridiculous. At this rate, I'll never get back to normal. Maybe I should just accept that my construction days are over. Is that what you want? To give up on something you've built your whole life around? I don't know what I want anymore. The admission slipped out before David could stop it, more honest than he'd been with anyone since the accident. 6 months ago, I knew exactly who I was, what I wanted, where I was going. Now I can barely walk across a room without planning the route. Billionaire stopped adjusting the resistance on the machine and pulled up a chair, sitting at eye level with him. Mr. Reynolds, can I ask you something personal? Might as well. You've already seen me sweat through a leg lift. When you were running those 5 miles every morning, climbing those construction sites, what were you running toward? What were you trying to build? The question caught him off guard. Success, security, a life that mattered, a legacy. And how did that work out for you? The words hung in the air between them, not cruel but direct in a way that cut through all his defenses. David stared at her, anger and something else, maybe recognition, warring in his chest. That's not fair. The accident wasn't my fault. Fair isn't my job. Results are. And sometimes getting results means asking questions that hurt. Bayera stood up, extending her hand. Come on. Let's try the balance exercises. And while we're working, maybe you can think about whether the life you're trying to get back to was actually working for you before the accident happened. David struggled through the next 20 minutes, failing at movements that should have been simple. Standing on one foot, walking a straight line, stepping up onto a low platform. Each failure felt like another confirmation that the man he'd been was gone forever. Over the following weeks, David learned that Bayera Santos wasn't impressed by his former wealth, his name on buildings, or his connections in the city. She'd grown up in East LA, the daughter of immigrants who'd worked 2 jobs each to put her through college and physical therapy school. Her parents had sacrificed everything they had, time, comfort, their own dreams, to give their daughter opportunities they'd never had. My father laid concrete for other people's buildings for 30 years, she told him one day as he worked through a particularly difficult session on the leg press. My mother cleaned office buildings at night after working in a factory during the day. They never owned anything impressive, never had their names on anything permanent. But they built something more important than any skyscraper. What's that? David asked, genuinely curious despite his exhaustion. They built a foundation for me. They built hope where there wasn't any before. They built a bridge between where they came from and where their daughter could go. The conversations continued session after session. Bayera had a way of challenging him that no one had in years. Not with business propositions or social climbing, but with honest questions about who he was versus who he pretended to be. Did you love your wife? She asked him one day, 6 months into his treatment. They were working on his gait, walking back and forth across the small clinic while she observed his form. David paused mid-step, considering the question more seriously than he'd considered anything in months. I thought I did. But I think I loved the idea of her, the way she looked on my arm, the way other men envied me for having her. That's not love, that's possession. What's the difference? Bayera stopped walking and turned to face him. Love sees the person. Possession sees the prize. Love asks what you can give. Possession asks what you can get. Love grows stronger during hard times. Possession disappears the moment things get difficult. David felt something shift inside his chest, not physical this time but emotional. For the first time since the accident he was looking forward to something. Not just the progress his leg was making, though that was encouraging. He was looking forward to these conversations, to the way Bayera challenged him to think about life differently, to the way she saw strength not as an absence of weakness but as the courage to keep going despite it. I understand loss, she told him during another session, this one focused on rebuilding the stability in his injured leg. Not the same as yours but loss all the same. The difference is what you do with it. What did you do with yours? Bayera was quiet for a moment, adjusting the weights on his ankle. I learned that strength isn't about not falling down. It's about getting back up every time you do. What did you lose? David asked gently. My husband, Miguel. We were high school sweethearts, married young. He died in Afghanistan when I was 26, leaving me with a 4-year-old daughter. Her voice was steady but David could hear the old pain underneath. For a while I thought my life was over too. But then I realized that Sophia needed me to show her that love doesn't end with loss. It transforms. David found himself holding his breath. How do you do that? Show her that love transforms. By living it. By choosing to love again even when it's scary. By teaching her that the people we lose never really leave us. They become part of how we love the people who come after. As David drove home that day, yes, he was driving again, another milestone Bayera had helped him reach, he couldn't stop thinking about her words. Love transforms. The people we lose become part of how we love the people who come after. Maybe his loss of Amanda, as devastating as it had been, wasn't the end of his story. Maybe it was just the end of a chapter he'd needed to close anyway. It was during David's 8th month of therapy that his world shifted in a way he never expected. He'd grown comfortable with his routine, 3 sessions a week with Bayera, steady progress that was rebuilding not just his leg but his confidence. The clinic had become a sanctuary, the one place where he felt like he was moving forward instead of just surviving. That Thursday afternoon, David arrived for his usual 4 p.m. session to find a small girl with dark curls sitting at the front desk, homework spread across the surface like she owned the place. She looked up when he walked in, studying him with the kind of unfiltered curiosity that only children possess. "Mom says you used to build big buildings," she said, not bothering with introductions. David glanced toward the back of the clinic where he could hear Baera finishing with her previous patient. "I did. Still do, sort of." "That's cool." The girl, Sophia, he realized, showed him a colorful Lego castle she'd constructed while waiting. "I like building things too. But Mom says the best buildings are the ones that help people, not just make money." David felt something shift inside his chest, a recognition that hit deeper than any of Baera's challenging questions. Here was a 9-year-old girl articulating something he'd spent 20 years forgetting. "Your mom is pretty smart," he said, settling into the waiting room chair beside her. "Yeah, she is. She fixed my friend Jake's dad when he hurt his back at work, and Mr. Rodriguez from the bodega. He couldn't lift boxes for like 2 months until Mom helped him." Sophia's voice carried the pride children have when talking about their heroes. "Mom fixes a lot of people." "She's helping me too," David admitted. Sophia studied him seriously, the way children do when they're trying to understand the adult world. "Are you broken?" The question was so direct, so innocent, that David found himself answering honestly. "Yeah, I think I was. Maybe not just my leg." "That's okay. Mom says everybody gets broken sometimes. The important thing is finding someone who knows how to help you heal the right way." David stared at this child who was casually dispensing wisdom that most adults spent years learning. "How do you know all this?" "My dad died when I was little," Sophia said matter-of-factly, the way children speak about difficult truths they've learned to carry. "Mom was really broken for a while. But she figured out how to fix herself so she could fix other people. She says healing is like building, you have to make sure the foundation is strong or everything else falls down." Before David could respond, Baera emerged from the back room, her previous patient heading toward the door with a smile and a promise to see her next week. "Sophia, sweetheart, I told you to wait quietly." But her voice held affection, not reproach. David and I were just talking about building things. Did you know he used to make skyscrapers?" Baera's eyes met David's and he saw something there, a mixture of pride in her daughter's social skills and concern about what Sophia might have shared. "She's quite the conversationalist," David said, standing to follow Baera to the treatment area. "She gets that from her father," Baera replied softly. "Miguel could talk to anyone about anything. Sophia inherited his gift for seeing the best in people." The conversation stayed with David for days. 2 weeks later, Sophia had another project, this time about heroes. "Not like superheroes," she explained to David while coloring a poster. "Real heroes. People who help other people even when it's hard or they don't get anything for it." "Who's your hero?" David asked. "My mom, obviously. But also my dad, even though he's not here anymore. Mom says he was helping protect people when he died, trying to make the world safer for families like ours." Sophia continued coloring, adding details to a figure she'd drawn. "Mom says heroes aren't people who never get scared or never fall down. Heroes are people who get back up and keep helping even when they're scared or hurt." David watched this 9-year-old girl work, her small hands steady as she created her vision of heroism. Everything about Sophia radiated the kind of confidence that came not from privilege or status, but from being genuinely loved and knowing her worth wasn't tied to what she owned or achieved. "Sophia, can I ask you something?" David said. "Sure. What makes someone worth loving?" Sophia looked up from her coloring, considering the question with the seriousness children bring to important matters. "Mom says people are worth loving just because they're people. You don't have to earn it or buy it or be perfect to deserve it. She says the best kind of love is when someone sees all the broken parts of you and chooses to stay anyway." "Your mom is very wise." "Yeah, she is. She says that's how my dad loved her and how she loved him. Even when things were scary or hard, they chose each other every day. She says that's what real love is, choosing the same person over and over, even when they're not perfect." David felt something profound settling into his understanding. He'd spent 8 years with Amanda, but had either of them ever chosen the other when things got difficult? Had either of them ever seen the broken parts and chosen to stay? As he drove home that evening, David realized that Sophia hadn't just been teaching him about buildings and bridges and heroes. She'd been teaching him about love, the kind of love her mother had shared with her father, the kind of love Baera was teaching her daughter to recognize and expect. For the first time since his divorce, David allowed himself to wonder, what would it feel like to love someone that way? And maybe more importantly, what would it feel like to be loved like that in return? The turning point came during David's 10th month of therapy, on an evening when Los Angeles traffic moved like honey and the clinic felt more like home than his apartment ever had. Baera had stayed late to work with him on a new exercise routine designed to strengthen the small stabilizing muscles around his knee, the kind of detailed work that required patience and trust. Hold it for 10 more seconds, Baera encouraged as David balanced on one foot while reaching for cones she'd placed at different heights. Your brain is rebuilding the neural pathways. This is where the real healing happens. David gritted his teeth, sweat beading on his forehead from the concentration required. 10 months ago this would have been impossible. 6 months ago he would have fallen immediately. Now, his body was remembering how to be strong in new ways. Time, Baera said, and David gratefully lowered his foot. That was your best session yet. The improvement in your proprioception is remarkable. My what? Proprioception. Your body's awareness of where it is in space. It's what lets you walk without thinking about every step, what helps you navigate stairs in the dark. The accident damaged those neural connections, but you've rebuilt them stronger than before. David wiped his face with the towel she handed him. You make it sound like I'm a different person than when I started. Aren't you? Baera asked, beginning to clean the equipment they'd used. The question hung between them as David considered it. Was he different? The man who'd walked into this clinic 10 months ago had been angry, broken, defined by his losses. He'd measured his worth by external achievements and other people's approval. That man felt like a stranger now. Yeah, he said quietly. I think I am. Baera's phone buzzed, interrupting the moment. She glanced at it and frowned. Everything okay? David asked. My babysitter just canceled. Sophia's at home doing homework, but I hate leaving her alone this late. Baera looked around the clinic, calculating how long it would take her to finish cleaning up and lock the building. I could drive you home, David offered, the words coming out before he'd fully thought them through. Baera hesitated. In all these months, they'd kept things professional despite the growing connection between them. She was his physical therapist. He was her patient. There were boundaries, ethical considerations, and professional protocols that mattered. But Sophia was 9 years old and alone, and the bus route from the clinic to their apartment in Culver City took 45 minutes on a good day. Are you sure? It's out of your way. I'm sure, David said and meant it. 20 minutes later, they were in David's car. A modest Honda he'd bought to replace the Maserati, practical and reliable in ways his old life had never been. They reached the modest apartment complex in Culver City as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange that reminded David how beautiful simple moments could be when you stopped rushing through them. Would you like to come up for coffee? Baera asked, then immediately looked flustered. I mean just coffee. To say thank you for the ride. David accepted, though he told himself it was just politeness. But as they climbed the stairs to the second floor, he felt something he hadn't experienced in months. Anticipation that had nothing to do with business or achievement and everything to do with simply spending time with someone whose company he genuinely enjoyed. Baera's apartment was small but warm, filled with the kind of details that made a space feel like a home rather than just a place to sleep. Sophia's artwork covered the refrigerator. Drawings of families, houses with gardens, stick figures holding hands under smiling suns. Family photos lined the mantel, showing Baera and Sophia with an extended network of aunts, uncles, and cousins who clearly adored them both. Books were everywhere, real books with worn covers and dog-eared pages, not the pristine architectural volumes that had decorated his old life for show. These were books that had been read, discussed, shared, loved. This feels like a home, David said without thinking. It is, Baera replied simply, putting coffee on to brew. Home isn't about square footage or zip codes. It's about the people who matter being safe and happy together. Can I ask you something? David said as Baera handed him a mug of coffee. Of course. Why did you become a physical therapist? Baera settled into the chair across from him, cradling her own mug. After Miguel died, I was lost for a while. Sophia was so young, and I was trying to figure out how to be everything she needed while dealing with my own grief. I went to therapy, not physical therapy but counseling, and my therapist said something that stayed with me. What was that? She said that healing happens in relationships. That we don't recover from trauma alone. We heal in connection with other people who understand both strength and vulnerability. When I decided to go back to school, I wanted to do work that honored that truth. David found himself leaning forward, drawn into her story in a way he'd never been drawn into Amanda's social updates or business networking conversations. Physical therapy is about more than just muscles and joints, Baiera continued. It's about helping people reconnect with their own strength, rediscover what their bodies can do, rebuild confidence that was shattered along with bones. It's healing in relationship. Is that what you've been doing with me? David asked quietly. Baiera met his eyes directly. What do you think? David considered the question, thinking about the man who'd walked into the clinic 10 months ago compared to the man sitting in this warm kitchen, drinking coffee and feeling more at peace than he had in years. I think you've been teaching me that strength isn't about never falling down. What is it about? Getting back up. Choosing to trust people again. Building things that matter instead of things that just impress people. David paused, looking around the apartment that felt more like home than his penthouse ever had. Learning what love actually looks like instead of what I thought it should look like. Something shifted in the air between them. Baiera's eyes held his for a moment longer than professional courtesy required, and David felt a pull toward her that had nothing to do with therapy and everything to do with the recognition of a kindred spirit. Mom, can David help me with my math homework? Sophia asked, breaking the moment but not the connection. He builds things, so he must be good with numbers. If he doesn't mind, Baiera said, her voice carefully neutral. David spent the next hour at Sophia's small table, helping her work through fraction problems and listening to her explain her strategy for completing a challenging art project. It was the most normal, domestic, peaceful hour he'd spent since before the accident. Maybe since before he'd gotten so caught up in building his empire that he'd forgotten what actual living felt like. When Sophia's homework was finished and she'd been tucked into bed with a story, David and Baiera found themselves back in the small living room, the space between them charged with unspoken possibilities. I should probably go, David said, though he made no move toward the door. Probably, Baiera agreed, though she didn't stand up from the couch where they'd settled after Sophia's bedtime routine. Baiera, David said, her name feeling different in his mouth than it had during their professional interactions. I need to tell you something. She waited, her brown eyes steady and patient in the way that had helped him through months of difficult healing. I think I'm falling in love with you, he said, the words coming out quietly but clearly. Maybe I already have fallen. But I'm scared as hell that you'll leave once I'm fully recovered, once I don't need you anymore professionally. The silence that followed felt like an eternity. David watched Baiera's face, trying to read her expression, wondering if he'd just destroyed the most important relationship in his life by crossing a line that should have remained uncrossed. Then she reached for his hand. David, she said softly, I stopped being your physical therapist months ago, at least in my heart. Professionally, yes, I'm helping your leg heal. But personally? You've been healing parts of me I didn't even know were broken. What do you mean? After Miguel died, I convinced myself that loving someone was too dangerous, too painful. I focused everything on Sophia and my work and told myself that was enough. But you? She smiled, tears glistening in her eyes. You make me remember that love isn't just about loss. It's about finding someone who sees who you really are and chooses to stay anyway. Even if I'm not rich anymore? Even if I can't give you the life Amanda wanted? Baiera laughed, the sound like music in the warm evening air. David, you're giving me something Amanda never had and never wanted. You're giving me the real you. The man who brings soup when my daughter is sick, who listens when I talk about my day, who's learning that strength comes from vulnerability, not from walls. I love you, David said, the words feeling more real than any contract he'd ever signed. I love you too, she replied, and David knew that everything, the accident, the betrayal, the loss, the pain, had been leading him to this moment, this woman, this chance to build something real and lasting on foundations that actually mattered. 18 months later, David stood at the altar of Santa Maria de Los Angeles, the small church in East LA where Baiera had been baptized, confirmed, and had learned the meaning of community from a congregation that treated faith as something lived rather than performed. The sanctuary wasn't grand, no soaring ceilings or imported marble, no arrangements that cost more than most families spent on groceries, but it was filled with something David had never experienced in all his years of luxury. Authentic love that asked nothing in return except the chance to celebrate two people who had found their way to each other through loss and healing. The morning had begun with nervous energy and the kind of anticipation that comes when you're about to promise forever to someone who has already proven they'll choose you during your worst moments. David had woken before dawn, not from anxiety but from excitement, lying in his Santa Monica apartment and thinking about how this day would mark not just the beginning of his marriage to Baiera, but the completion of his transformation from a man who built monuments to his own success into someone who understood that the most important construction projects were the relationships you built with people who mattered. Tony Ramirez had arrived early to help David get ready, bringing coffee from the Mexican bakery near the construction site where they were building their latest affordable housing complex. Tony had become more than David's foreman over the past year. He'd become a friend who understood both the technical and emotional aspects of building things meant to last. "You ready for this, boss?" Tony asked as he helped David adjust his tie, not a designer piece that cost more than most people's weekly salary, but something simple and elegant that Baera had helped him choose during one of their walks through Santa Monica. "More than ready," David replied, and meant it in a way he'd never meant anything before. "Nervous but ready." "Good nervous, you know?" "I know. Same way I felt before I married Carmen 15 years ago. Like you're about to start the best adventure of your life with the person you want beside you for every step." David looked at himself in the mirror, not the perfectly groomed image he'd once presented to the world, but someone real, weathered by experience, stronger for having been broken and rebuilt. His leg would always be slightly stiff, a reminder of the accident that had changed everything, but he no longer saw it as a limitation. It was evidence of survival, of the capacity to heal, of the journey that had led him to this moment. The church filled slowly with people who represented the life David had built over the past 18 months. Baera's extended family packed the wooden pews, aunts and uncles and cousins who had embraced David not because of what he could provide, but because of how he loved their Baera and how she lit up when she talked about him. Her parents sat in the front row, her father's calloused hands folded in his lap, her mother dabbing tears with a handkerchief that had belonged to her own mother and would someday belong to Sophia. On David's side sat a smaller group, but one that meant everything to him. The employees from Reynolds Construction who had become real friends during his recovery, men and women who had stood by the company when it would have been easier to find work elsewhere, who had believed in David's vision for building something different. Maria Santos, the project manager who had helped him transition from luxury developments to community-focused construction. James Wright, the architect who specialized in affordable housing design. Carmen and Tony's teenage kids, who had adopted David as an honorary uncle and teased him mercilessly about being nervous. Father Martinez, who had known Baera since she was Sophia's age, had spent time with David over the past months, not trying to convert him but helping him understand the traditions that would make this day meaningful for the woman he loved. They had talked about marriage as a sacred commitment, about the difference between a wedding and a marriage, about the daily choice to love someone even when it's difficult. "You know," Father Martinez had said during one of their conversations, "some people think love is a feeling that happens to you. But real love, the kind that builds lasting marriages, is a decision you make every day. It's choosing to see the best in someone even when they're not at their best. It's choosing to stay when leaving would be easier. It's choosing to build something together that's stronger than what either of you could build alone." The church doors opened, and Sophia appeared first, radiant in a white dress with flowers in her dark hair, scattering rose petals down the aisle with the kind of joy that only children can bring to ceremony. She had been part of every wedding planning decision, from choosing flowers to helping design the simple programs to insisting that the reception include dancing because weddings should be happy, not just fancy. Sophia caught David's eye as she walked down the aisle and gave him a thumbs up, the gesture so perfectly Sophia that he had to swallow hard to keep from tearing up before the bride even appeared. Over the past 18 months, Sophia had become not just Baera's daughter but David's stepdaughter in every way that mattered. They had built their relationship slowly, carefully, with the understanding that trust takes time and that children are wise enough to know when adults are pretending versus when they genuinely care. They had spent Saturday mornings at construction sites, with Sophia wearing a hard hat that was too big for her head and asking questions about how buildings stayed up and whether David thought houses had personalities like people did. They had worked on homework together, with David discovering that helping a child understand fractions was more satisfying than closing million-dollar deals. They had talked about Miguel, with Sophia sharing memories of the father she barely remembered and David learning how to honor the love that had come before him rather than feeling threatened by it. "You know what I like about you?" Sophia had asked him one evening while they worked on a particularly challenging science project about simple machines. "What's that?" "You don't try to be my dad. Miguel was my dad and he always will be. But you're something different. You're like, my David. And that's special too." Then the music changed and Baera stepped into the doorway, and David felt his breath catch in his throat. She wasn't wearing a designer gown that cost more than most people's cars, nothing that would require a team of people to help her navigate or would photograph well for magazines that would never see it anyway. Her dress was simple, elegant, chosen because it made her feel beautiful rather than because it would impress people who didn't matter. Her dark hair was styled simply, adorned with flowers Sophia had helped her choose from the church garden that morning. But it was her smile that took David's breath away, not the practiced expression of a woman performing for an audience, but the genuine, radiant joy of someone who had found her person and was choosing him in front of everyone who mattered to them both. Her eyes found his across the sanctuary, and in that look was everything they had built together. Trust earned through vulnerability, love grown through patience, commitment forged through the choice to see each other clearly and stay anyway. As she walked down the aisle on her father's arm, David thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment. The accident that had seemed like the end of everything. Amanda's betrayal that had felt like it would destroy him. The months of physical therapy that had rebuilt not just his leg but his understanding of what strength actually meant. The conversations with Sophia that had taught him what love looked like when it was real. The evening when Baera had reached for his hand and told him that he'd been healing parts of her she didn't even know were broken. "Dearly beloved," Father Martinez began, his voice carrying the warmth of someone who had known Baera since she was Sophia's age and had watched her grow from a grieving young widow into a woman ready to love again. "We are gathered here today to witness the union of two people who have learned that love is not about perfection, but about choosing each other through imperfection. David and Baera have both known loss, both known the courage it takes to trust again, both learned that the strongest foundations are often built on the ground where something else once stood." The ceremony was conducted in both English and Spanish, honoring Baera's heritage while including David in a tradition that felt more meaningful than any social event he'd ever attended. When it came time for vows, David spoke words he'd written himself, drawing from everything Baera and Sophia had taught him about love, about bridges, about building foundations that could weather any storm. "Baera," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm him, 18 months ago I thought I knew what success looked like. I measured my worth in buildings that reached toward the sky, in possessions that impressed strangers, in achievements that ultimately left me empty. But you taught me that the most important construction project isn't what we build upward, it's what we build between us, inside us, for the people who matter most." He paused, looking at Sophia in the front row, then back at Baera's tear-filled eyes. "You showed me that love isn't about possession but about partnership. That strength isn't about never falling down, but about having someone who will help you get back up every time you do. That home isn't about square footage or addresses, but about choosing the same person every day even when, especially when, things get difficult." David took a breath, feeling the weight of the promise he was about to make and the joy of being able to make it to someone who would honor it in return. "I promise to see you every day, not just the version of you that makes me comfortable but all of you, your strength and your fears, your dreams and your doubts, your beautiful imperfections that make you exactly who you are. I promise to choose you not just when you're easy to love, but when love requires courage, patience, forgiveness. I promise to build with you, not just a life, but a legacy of love that Sophia can learn from and carry forward." Baera's vows spoke of second chances, of healing that happens in relationship, of the courage it takes to love again after loss. She promised to help him remember that the man he had become, kind, strong, present, real, was worth loving not because of what he could provide, but because of who he chose to be when no one was watching except the people who mattered most. "I promise to love not just the successful parts of you, but the broken parts too," she said, her voice clear and strong. "I promise to believe in your dreams even when you doubt them, to celebrate your victories and sit with you through your defeats. I promise to build bridges with you, not just in the buildings you design but in our marriage, in our family, in our community. And I promise to choose you every day not because love is easy, but because you are worth every difficult moment, every act of forgiveness, every choice to stay and build something beautiful together." When Father Martinez pronounced them husband and wife, and David kissed his bride for the first time as her husband, the entire church erupted in celebration that felt like pure joy made audible. Sophia cheered from the front row, Baera's aunts wiped away tears, and Tony shouted something in Spanish that made everyone laugh. The reception was held in the church hall, decorated with flowers from the community garden and filled with food prepared by Baera's aunts who had refused to let anyone else handle the cooking for their girl's wedding day. The mariachi band was made up of men from the neighborhood who had known Baera since she was small, and they played with the kind of heart that can't be hired, only earned through years of community and shared celebration. David found himself dancing with Sophia to a mariachi version of Beautiful Boy, watching his new stepdaughter giggle as he spun her around the simple dance floor that had hosted countless quinceañeras, anniversary parties and community celebrations. "Are you happy, David?" Sophia asked during a quieter moment between songs. Happier than I've ever been, he told her truthfully. Good. Mom deserves someone who makes her laugh like you do. And I like having a dad who builds things that help people. Sophia paused, then added with the seriousness that sometimes surprised adults, Miguel was my first dad, and he'll always be special because he helped make me. But you're my second dad, and you're special because you chose me even though you didn't have to. David felt his throat tighten with emotion. Sophia, choosing you and your mom was the easiest decision I've ever made. You two are the best thing that ever happened to me. Later that evening, as they drove to their honeymoon destination, a small bed and breakfast in Santa Barbara rather than some exotic resort that would require passports and weeks of planning, Baera reached across the car and took David's hand. Thank you, she said softly, her wedding ring catching the light from the dashboard. For what? For showing Sophia what it looks like when someone chooses our family not because they have to, but because they want to. She's never had that before. Even with Miguel, wonderful as he was, we were so young when we got married that it was different. This is the first time she's seen someone fall in love with us as we are now, with all our history and complications. Thank you for letting me be part of it, David replied, lifting their joined hands to kiss her knuckles. For teaching me what love actually feels like when it's real. For being patient while I learned the difference between loving someone and possessing them. You were a good student, Baera teased, but her voice was tender. I had an excellent teacher. 6 months later, David stood in the construction trailer at his latest project site, reviewing blueprints for Paradise Gardens, a mixed-income housing development that would provide affordable homes for working families while creating community spaces where children like Sophia could play safely and parents could build relationships with their neighbors. The project was a collaboration between Reynolds Construction and 3 community organizations, designed not just to provide housing but to strengthen the fabric of the neighborhood. The profit margins were smaller than his old luxury projects, but the satisfaction was immeasurable. Every unit that would house a family, every community center that would serve a neighborhood, every playground that would echo with children's laughter felt like a small monument to the lessons Baera and Sophia had taught him about what truly mattered. Reynolds Construction had been rebuilt from the ground up, literally and philosophically. The company now specialized in affordable housing, community centers, and public projects that served people rather than just enriching investors. David's employees took pride in work that made their own communities better, and the company culture reflected values that David had learned during his darkest hours. That strength comes from helping others, that success is measured by positive impact rather than personal accumulation, that the best buildings are the ones that bring people together rather than separating them. Boss, the city inspector is here for the final walkthrough on the community center, Tony called from the trailer door, his hard hat pushed back on his head and satisfaction evident in his voice. Tell him I'll be right there, David replied, rolling up the blueprints and heading out to inspect work he was genuinely proud of. The community center was beautiful in its simplicity and functionality. Large windows that let in natural light, flexible spaces that could accommodate everything from children's after-school programs to senior citizen activities, a commercial kitchen where neighborhood families could cater their own celebrations, art studios where people like Sophia could explore their creativity regardless of their family's financial situation. This is good work, the inspector said, making notes on his clipboard. You can tell it was designed by people who actually care about the community it's going to serve. That evening, David arrived home to their house in Manhattan Beach. Not a mansion that impressed strangers, but a real home with character instead of status, warmth instead of showiness, and most importantly, the feeling that this was the place where David wanted to come at the end of every day for the rest of his life. The house had taken months to find and months more to make their own. David had learned to see real estate through different eyes, looking not for investment potential or social prestige but for the qualities that would make Sophia feel secure, that would give Baera space for her books and plants, that would accommodate the family dinners and homework sessions and quiet conversations that make a house into a home. He could hear Sophia practicing piano in the living room, working through a piece she'd learned specifically because David had mentioned liking it during one of their Saturday morning construction site visits. The melody floated through the house like a soundtrack to contentment, mixing with the sounds of Baera moving through the kitchen as she prepared dinner. How was your day? She asked, turning to kiss him as he wrapped his arms around her from behind, breathing in the scent of her hair and the dinner she was cooking and the indefinable smell of home. Good. Really good. The community center passed final inspection. We'll be able to open it next month, just in time for the summer programs. That's wonderful. Sophia will be so excited. She's been telling all her friends about the art studio you included in the design. David watched his stepdaughter through the kitchen doorway, her small hands moving confidently across the piano keys, her face lit with concentration and joy. In 18 months, she'd grown from a 9-year-old who was curious about his buildings to an 11-year-old who bragged to her friends about her stepdad who builds houses for families instead of just rich people. Their relationship had developed naturally, built on shared interests and genuine affection rather than forced bonding activities. Sophia had taught David how to see construction through a child's eyes, not just as engineering and profit margins, but as spaces where people would live their lives, where children would take first steps and families would share meals and communities would grow stronger. "David," Bayera said, turning in his arms with a smile that carried news he could read in her eyes before she spoke the words, "I have something to tell you." Something in her tone made him pay attention, though the smile on her face told him it was good news, the kind that would change everything in the best possible way. "What is it?" She reached up to touch his face, her wedding ring warm against his cheek. "We're going to need to start thinking about converting the spare room into a nursery." David felt the world shift around him in the most beautiful way possible, the same way it had shifted when he'd first realized he was falling in love with her, when she'd first said she loved him too, when Sophia had first called him, "My David." "Really? Really? Sophia is going to be a big sister. And you're going to be a dad." David lifted Bayera off her feet, spinning her around the kitchen while she laughed and Sophia called from the piano bench, "What's all the noise about?" "Come here, sweetheart," Bayera called. "We have something to tell you." As they gathered Sophia into their embrace and shared the news that their family was growing, David thought about the man he'd been 3 years ago. That man had measured his life in concrete and steel, in bank accounts and business deals, in possessions and achievements that ultimately meant nothing when crisis came. That man had built walls instead of bridges, monuments instead of homes, success that impressed strangers instead of love that sustained family. This man, the one holding his pregnant wife and his stepdaughter in a kitchen filled with the smell of home-cooked dinner and the sound of piano music, measured his life in love given and received, in the daily choice to show up for the people who mattered most, in the foundation he was building not upward toward some imaginary success, but inward and outward, creating a legacy that would last long after any building he'd ever constructed had crumbled. His leg would always be a little stiff, a reminder of the accident that had changed everything. The scar tissue would always be there, evidence of trauma that had once seemed like the end of the world. But as he listened to his wife humming and his stepdaughter playing a song she'd learned just for him, as he felt the life growing inside Bayera and thought about the baby who would call him dad from their very first word, David realized that sometimes the most devastating breaks lead to the strongest foundations. He'd spent years building upward, reaching for heights that ultimately meant nothing. Now he was building something that would last. A life based on love, commitment, and the radical idea that the best things in life couldn't be bought or sold, only earned through the daily choice to show up for the people who mattered most. Amanda had been right about one thing. He wasn't the same man she'd married. He was stronger, kinder, more present, more real. He was a man who understood that love wasn't about what you could provide, but about who you chose to be when the cameras weren't rolling and the audience had gone home. He was a man who built bridges instead of walls, who measured success in smiles instead of dollars, who knew that the most important construction project of his life was the family he was building with Bayera and Sophia and the child on the way. Thank God for that. On their first wedding anniversary, David woke up early to make breakfast while Bayera slept in. A luxury they'd insisted on giving themselves despite Sophia's early morning energy and Bayera's pregnancy making sleep both more necessary and more elusive. The baby was due in 3 months, and their lives had taken on the particular rhythm of expectant families. Doctor's appointments and nursery preparation, discussions about names and parenting philosophies, the sweet anticipation of meeting someone who would change everything again in the most wonderful way. The morning light streamed through windows that didn't cost a fortune but let in just the right amount of California sunshine, painting their kitchen in golden hues that made even ordinary moments feel magical. He could hear Sophia in the living room, practicing a new piece on the piano, the notes floating through their home like a soundtrack to contentment. His phone buzzed with a text from Tony about the ribbon-cutting ceremony for their latest affordable housing complex, followed by a message from one of their tenants thanking him for creating a place where her children could grow up safely. There was an email from the community center director with photos of children using the art studio, and a voice message from Father Martinez asking if David would speak to a group of young men about finding purpose in their work. This was success, David realized as he flipped pancakes and listened to his family beginning their day around him. Not the hollow achievement of impressing strangers with expensive things they couldn't afford, but the deep satisfaction of building something that mattered with people who chose him not for what he could provide, but for who he was when everything else was stripped away. The accident that had destroyed David's old life had been the best thing that ever happened to him, though it had taken him 3 years to understand why. Sometimes we have to lose everything we think we want to discover everything we actually need. Sometimes the most beautiful love stories begin with the most devastating endings. And sometimes, when we stop building walls and start building bridges, we discover that the foundation we've been searching for has been waiting in the most unexpected places all along. True wealth isn't measured in what we accumulate, but in what we build together with the people we love. If this story moved you, hit that subscribe button and share it with someone who needs to remember that our greatest treasures are often found in our most ordinary moments. Thank you for watching.